Hello, and welcome to another edition of the AQA Poetry Anthology Analysis from TGS English. Today we are going to explore the wonderful poem by Ted Hughes called Bayonet Charge, one of my personal favourites. It's a fantastic war poem. You've obviously read Charge for the Light Brigade already, and it really is so evocative and creates such sympathy for this soldier who the poem is about, that I think you'll love it. So let's move on. As I'm sure you are used to this by now, you will need some highlighters and some pens for annotating. If you can't print out a poem, that's no problem, but please make sure that you've got some paper so that you can make some notes on some key quotations. And hopefully by the end of this session, you will have a lovely set of notes for this poem. So, before we start, some of you might be thinking, what is a bayonet? What is a bayonet charge? And a bayonet refers to a piece of weaponry that soldiers had during World War I in particular. A bayonet is a knife or dagger on the edge of a rifle. And you can see in the image here that we have soldiers holding their bayonets here as they charge through man's land. So soldiers would use these to either save ammunition or if they had run out. And the whole purpose of having a knife there is to plunge that into the enemy, which shows you just how close in proximity soldiers could be with those on the opposition. So it really was a terrifying ordeal, and to have a bayonet meant that you really were on the front line of war. So I just want to talk you through a bit of context for this poem, because it is important to understand some of the things that were happening during the time that this poem is arguably set. And also a little bit about Ted Hughes, although you're not expected to write an autobiography on Ted Hughes in your exam. So this poem was published in 1957, nearly 40 years after World War I ended. And it was actually published in Ted Hughes's first anthology of poems that he had published as a professional poet. Ted Hughes was infamously married to the American poet Sylvia Plath in 1956, obviously 1 year before this poem was published. Now, Sylvia Plath is a very well-known and well-respected American poet, and she's known also for her tragic life. She sadly committed suicide in 1963, just 7 years after she was married to Ted Hughes. So some critics have said that this poem and the fear, the terror, the horrors might be a way of Hughes exploring some of his own emotions, potentially caused by or triggered by some of the sadness in his life. But I don't think that's necessary to talk about during your essay. It's just an interesting thing to know about. And then in terms of World War I, we have to think, like I said earlier, about the fact that soldiers would have experienced face-to-face combat. Okay, so they would have been so close to their enemies that they would have had to use their bayonets to stab the enemy across from them. You can see another picture here. These men are holding their bayonets, so you have the rifle there, and then you have the knife there on the end of it. And in this poem, Hughes centres his poem on one soldier, and he zooms in to this experience of this unnamed soldier and takes us through a moment in time, a moment of realisation for this soldier. And I think it does help us to really think about what might have been going through those soldiers' minds. An impossible task, such an uncertain situation that you can't even prepare for, even if you think you can. So to follow up on that, I just wanted to think about the idea of patriotism, because this is a really central idea within the poem. You can see here that there is a picture that was used as part of propaganda in the First World War, and it says, "Your chums are fighting, why aren't you?" Chums obviously meaning friends, and that direct address there, why aren't you? is really putting that burden, that responsibility, that accountability onto any man reading that poster. And propaganda, as some of you might have learnt about in history, was a really important part of the process to get people to fight during World War I. So before conscription, before men were forced to fight, the British government relied on this propaganda to justify the war to the people and to encourage men to sign up. You have probably heard of the slogan, "Your country needs you," with the man who is pointing at the reader, the viewer. And men were promised this idea of heroism, of a patriotic legacy, of honouring their family, their country. And it was very much glamorised. And it worked. Men signed up, hoping to be a hero, to serve their country, to be honourable. However, what we do know is that when men arrived at war and they experienced the first-hand horrors of it, they had a very different experience to what the media portrayed. And if you've heard or even read any poems by Wilfred Owen, obviously Exposure is part of this anthology, then you will know that a lot of men wrote about very different experiences of World War I. Surprisingly or not, this was left out of the media's narrative. So, the soldier in Bayonet Charge appears to be questioning his motives for being there. He has obviously gone into this war for his country, to be patriotic, to serve his people, to serve the monarchy. But he is now in war and he feels very differently about the situation. Before we read the poem, I want you to just pause and to write down any emotions that you might expect from a soldier who has signed up to fight for his country and is now experiencing the true horrors of war away from their loved ones. What do you think they might feel? Okay, so maybe you wrote down scared, excited, confused, fear, terror, horror. Let's have a look at what this soldier feels, thinks, and does. What I would like you to do is to read or listen to the poem twice, because it's really important to give yourself time to process the content of the poem. And I want you to focus on the key events of this poem. So what is the soldier doing? What is the soldier thinking? What is the soldier feeling? What realizations does he have as the poem progresses? And if you can, start to think perhaps about this poem contrasts with a poem like Charge of the Light Brigade.
Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw, in raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. Hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air, he lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm. The patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame, and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet toward the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc. dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors touchy dynamite.
I'll just give you a few moments to reread the poem and to really start thinking about what is happening. We can't analyse deeper layers of poetry until we are really confident that we know what is happening on the surface level of that poem. If it helps, break it up stanza by stanza. Okay, so I'm just going to talk you through the main idea and event in each stanza, just so that you can check that you are on the right page and that you're confident with what this poem is about. In stanza 1, the soldier appears to be jolted awake. If you remember, it starts with the adverb suddenly. He springs into action straight away, and we call this medias res, okay? The poem begins in medias res. It's a Latin term, and it means in the midst of things, in the middle of the action. So the soldier is in a field, and he is running. He clearly lacks confidence, and he is already starting to lose his faith in his country and his patriotism. And this is something that's built on and built on throughout the poem. So we have a very vulnerable soldier, we have a soldier who appears to be isolated, and the primary action is running. He is on the move. In stanza 2, he almost stops running, questioning his very reason for being in war, as he considers the systems and structures, for example the government, that were responsible for this. So he really questions the people that put him there, that put him in this position that is so very terrifying. As we move to the final stanza, the soldier's fear and loss of purpose intensifies, so it gets bigger. And in the third and final stanza, he witnesses a hare get caught up in the crossfire. He loses all of the superficial qualities that once inspired him, for example, to serve his king, to have honour, to have dignity. And sadly, all that remains by the end is his terror that could explode at any moment. So, time for the fun part, time to get annotating. So make sure you've got your highlighters and pens at the ready. Like I said earlier, if you haven't been able to print out a copy of the poem, that is not a problem. What I would encourage you to do is to copy out the key quotations that we're about to look at and make some notes of your own. So the first key quotation that we're going to have a look at is from stanza 1, and it describes the soldier and him carrying his weaponry. It says, "He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest." So, first of all, we're going to focus on the verb lugged. So this verb really emphasises the burden of war as well as the weapon itself, both literally and metaphorically. So it's literally talking about how he is holding his rifle. However, it is symbolic because it represents how he is dragging with effort himself through this war. And perhaps the soldier does not wish to use it, or he feels unable to, okay? If we move on to look at the second part of this line, we find a simile, numb as a smashed arm. And this simile continues Hughes's pattern of using body parts to examine his physical and mental deterioration. So it's important, if you can, when looking at a quotation and zooming in, to think about how that quotation fits in with the rest of the poem. And if you look at the wider poem, you'll see that he refers to body parts in other parts. And if you're able to write about that in your analysis, that's showing the examiner that you're looking at the poem as a whole alongside zooming in. So here in this simile, Hughes is showing how his weapon is useless to him because of how he is feeling emotionally. The image also implies physical pain to further reinforce the soldier's anguish. And that's what's so clever about this simile. It is a combined impact of both the physical and mental feelings of this soldier. The imagery here in the next line also blends sadness, anger, and love. The patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. The soldier's once patriotic values are leaving him in the form of hot, wet tears, and they are melting straight from his heart. Okay? So this really exposes the expectation versus reality of war, and perhaps alludes to the soldier being deceived. Perhaps he looked at those propaganda posters and truly believed that his purpose was to go to war and fight for his country. Like I said earlier, this is built upon as the poem continues. So making comments like that would help for your structure. Overall, the soldier is really vulnerable here, both physically and psychologically. His panic and uncertainty, fused with his anonymous persona, perhaps reflects a universal experience of a naive soldier missold war. The second quotation is from stanza 2, and this is one of my personal favourite lines from all of the poems in the anthology, because I just think it's so clever how Hughes has done this, and it's really pertinent. It says, "In bewilderment then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? Normally, in my classroom at this point, I would draw a clock with a minute hand, an hour hand, a second hand, and I would take the students through my version of this image. I can't do that on video, so I'm going to talk you through it instead. Now, this image is so powerful, and this moment of the poem revolves around the extended metaphor of clockwork. So I'm not talking about a digital clock here, I'm talking about your old-fashioned clocks with all the hands and the numbers in a circle. The soldier at this point is considering the destiny that brought him here. But instead of a natural order idea of fate and what is naturally destined to be in the stars for you, it is the cold decisions of the government and those in power that led him to this moment, as you can see when he thinks about the stars and the nations in the same idea. So I read this as the soldier positioning himself in the second hand of the clock, the one that is constantly moving to make the other hands on a watch move. Now, what I'm talking about there is the idea that obviously the second hand is constantly going. When the second hand has done a rotation, the minute hand moves once, even though the second hand has already moved 60 times for each second. And then the minute hand moves 60 times in an hour, and then we change the hour hand. So the soldier, the second hand, is the one doing a lot of the work. Personally, I think this is a very clever image of Hughes. The soldier is the worker, the one physically and emotionally exerting himself for the benefit of those in power, in this metaphor for the minute hand, the hour hand. Perhaps you could argue that Hughes is subtly alluding to the corruption of war and the hierarchy within it. So the hierarchy refers to that system of power, that ladder of power. You've got people in government making decisions, you've got people in the press making the propaganda posters, and ultimately the people who are living, breathing, suffering these decisions are people like this soldier. And this image ends in a rhetorical question, and it really reminds the reader of the soldier's uncertainty and perhaps regret about being here. It is not the confident, brave hero image that the media heavily promoted. So to summarise this beautiful image. The soldier here is distracted by his thoughts and nearly stops moving because of them. He is trying to understand why he is here, in this moment, running and scared. The soldier appears isolated, helping to emphasise his desperation. We really feel like no one else exists as Hughes takes us into the mind of this soldier. Our final key quotation is from the third stanza, the third and final one. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm, to get out of that blue crackling air, his terrors, touchy dynamite. Another really powerful moment in this poem. So Hughes here is using an ascendetic list to highlight the soldier's motivations for joining the war effort. So we see things like king, honour, human dignity, things that would entice a man to be a soldier in this war, to serve his country, to be patriotic, an idea that we've spoken about throughout this poem. However, the list subtly helps point to how meaningless they have become for him now, especially because he chooses to end the line with etc. to devalue them. And so it shows that they could really be anything. They don't matter anymore as individual reasons for fighting. In fact, they don't matter so much that they have been dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. The simile here brings together pre-war and during. The noun luxuries depicts the reasons as non-essential and actually quite indulgent, which could be another attack on the British propaganda and the war narrative that they were selling. The yelling alarm represents the soldiers' increasing panic that builds throughout the poem to an uncontrollable level. We feel really uncomfortable by this point. We feel worried for the soldier. We perhaps feel angry for the soldier and the reasons that has brought him here. Hughes uses quite a lot of colour and nature imagery in this poem. If you remember a few lines above, he talks about the hair. And here, the blue crackling air arguably represents an uncomfortable picture of reality, and nature has now been invaded by war. Okay? And what's quite interesting about the structure of that image there is the word crackling has been placed in the middle of blue air. So it's kind of like the crackling is this disruption, this war, this rifle fire, for example. That's literally invaded the blue air. So that's quite a nice structural observation. And this culminates in the final line of the poem, personifying the soldier's fear, which is, again, a really, really powerful image and has lots going on if you think about the use of alliteration here as well to mirror the sound of that dynamite, that fuse kind of ticking away. Hughes presents an ambiguous fate for the soldier, so we don't know what's going to happen to him. There's no resolution. And again, this is much like a soldier during the war, living day to day with no knowledge of what will happen. His fear is so explosive that it could overwhelm him at any moment. If you think about the poem Exposure, and those soldiers are living in fear every second, but nothing happens. It's that uncertainty that can be just as terrifying as gunfire. So really this soldier's uncertainty, his terror, exists all the time, even when he's running through a field. So Hughes concludes his poem with amplified images and ideas that have been central to the poem throughout. The falsity of patriotism, the traumatic nature of being a soldier in war, and the power of fear and uncertainty. Ultimately, this poem is creating sympathy for the soldier and encourages anger at the power systems that promote war. So that concludes the initial exploration of this poem with your key quotations, and I'm sure that your teacher will or has already taken you through some other key moments and ideas. The fun part of poetry is then revisiting it and dissecting it and sharing your ideas and interpretations with each other. That's what I love, because every year that I teach these poems, someone will say something that I've never heard of before. So I really would encourage you to share your ideas, to challenge each other's interpretations, and to really debate and discuss. Now, part of this exam is connecting poems. So you need to think about the themes, the key ideas, and what other poems they might link to. Don't worry if you don't recognise some of these poem names yet, you will do. So I've chosen 3 key ideas for this poem: a soldier's experience, the psychological impact of war, and the horrors of war. And under each one, I've put some poems that I think would couple up nicely with Bayonet Charge to compare and contrast. So with a soldier's experience, that could even be a question that you're asked in your exam to explore, to compare and contrast the way poets present the soldier's experience. You need a poem that is about a soldier or multiple soldiers. So we've got Remains, we've got Charge of the Light Brigade, we've got Exposure, Kamikaze. Okay, the psychological, the mental, emotional impact of war. Again, Remains is very good for that. Exposure is fantastic for that. And finally, the horrors of war. Similarly, Exposure, but also Charge of the Light Brigade. They just deal with it very differently. And War Photographer. Now, War Photographer is a really interesting, beautifully written poem with lots of images about the horrors of war. And again, we have a different interpretation because Duffy is looking at people at home, their perspective, their brief emotional connection, followed by moving on, a desensitization. So you've got a really nice complexity of ideas there to compare with Bayonet Charge. And now I really want to encourage you to explore this poem and ideas with your classmates, with your teacher, and really reflect about the ideas that you've encountered in this poem. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you really like this poem and appreciate what Hughes is doing, and really kind of think about what that soldier is thinking and feeling, and how a lot of those emotions and experiences are still very relevant to soldiers today, to people today facing uncertainty, and people who are ultimately doing things for the benefit of others. That's it from me for now. I will leave you to explore this further with your teacher, and I hope to speak to you about it at some point soon. Take care. Bye.